Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're putting on our historian hats and opening up a seriously fascinating case file. So if you know anything about the history of early Buddhism, you definitely know the name Buddhaghosa. He's this universally revered 5th century scholar and translator. Now, mainstream history firmly records him as an Indian citizen who traveled to Sri Lanka to translate sacred texts. But what if that universally accepted geography is just completely wrong? We're looking at a pretty paradigm-shifting counter-theory today from a recent source. It argues that Buddhaghosa actually never stepped foot in India. In fact, it suggests he lived, traveled, and worked entirely within the borders of ancient Sri Lanka. It's a really bold claim, and we're going to look at the exact evidence they used to build this theory.
Here's how we're going to break down the case file today. We'll look at geographic texts, ancient boat travel, the Sinhalese script, reassessing the book burning, and finally, the unresolved puzzle.
All right, let's jump into Section 1, the Buddhaghosa geography theory.
Okay, to really understand this alternative theory, we first have to look at the foundational texts. And here's the wild part. Mainstream history and this counter-theory actually pull from the exact same ancient records. We're talking about Chapter 37 of the Mahavamsa. But, as historians, we have to meticulously assess the credibility of these sources, right? The Mahavamsa, for instance, was compiled centuries after the events and often blends myth right in with the historical record. We're also looking at texts like the Pujavalya, Siddhama Sangaha, and Buddhaghosa's own writings, the Visuddhimagga, and the Atasalini. Crucially, there's also the Buddhaghosa Patti. Those are Burmese travel accounts translated into English by James Gray back in 1892. The source we're analyzing today basically argues that if you cross-examine the physical and geographical descriptions within these exact texts without any outside bias, they simply do not describe a journey between India and Sri Lanka. Instead, they describe a highly localized journey entirely within a single country.
Moving on to Section 2, evaluating historical textual evidence. So the logistics of the travel narratives in these texts are exactly where the mainstream theory starts to look mathematically, suspicious. According to the accounts found in the Burmese texts, there is a very specific timeline for this journey. Buddhaghosa departs from a place called Dambadiva, which is traditionally believed to be in India, and he's heading to the Mahavihara in Lanka. Now, on the exact same day, another monk named Buddhadatta, who couldn't complete his translation work, is departing Lanka, heading back to Dambadiva. And according to these Burmese accounts, exactly 3 days into their journey, their vessels meet and literally collide face to face. So, mathematically, this means the entire journey between these two ports is a maximum of a 5 or 6 day trip, since they met exactly in the middle. Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, ancient boats and inland travel. That strict 6-day timeline, it completely shatters when you apply it to the actual geography of the Indian Ocean. Think about it. The sea route between northern India and Sri Lanka via the Bay of Bengal is roughly 2,500 kilometers. Ancient ocean-faring ships relied entirely on monsoon winds, which blow in one direction for an entire season. You literally cannot have two wind-dependent sailing ships traveling in opposite directions and meeting face-to-face in the middle of the ocean. It's aerodynamically impossible. Our source argues that this text isn't describing an ocean voyage at all. It's actually describing a journey on an interconnected inland canal system. Picture this. On a calm inland reservoir, navigated by pushing long poles rather than relying on massive sails, a 6-day round trip and a midpoint face-to-face collision is highly probable. It just makes historical sense.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the archaeological side of the argument too. The text uses words that translators often interpret as massive ships. But archaeological discoveries in places like Anuradhapura and Ratnapura have unearthed what are called bata uru. These were large ancient inland canoes meant for traversing Sri Lanka's massive internal water networks like the Parakama Samudra. So the theory posits that Buddhaghosa was simply traveling along these vast internal canals, which perfectly aligns with that tight timeline and the face-to-face collision described in the ancient texts. All right, let's get into Section 4, the Sinhalese script mystery.
We've looked at the geography, we've looked at the boats, but now we arrive at our most compelling forensic evidence in this whole case file, the linguistics. This is the big Socratic question the source poses to mainstream historians, and it directly contrasts those Burmese travel accounts with the actual text of his work. According to the travel accounts we just talked about, Buddhaghosa wrote his commentary, the Atasalini, while living in Dambadiva, again, northern India according to mainstream history, well before his supposed journey. Yet, the original text of the Atasalini is composed entirely in the Sinhalese script. So why on earth would a northern Indian scholar, completely surrounded by Sanskrit and Devnimori, write a massive text in a regional script from an island 2,500 kilometers away? Let's break down the linguistic landscape and how it was evolving during this era. You had Hela Atua, which were deep, regional, spoken Sinhala dialects, really the language of the common people, that was rapidly evolving across the island. Then you had Magavi or Pali, which was evolving as this formalized, international, scholarly language. Meanwhile, up in northern India at the time, scholars like the Jains were writing in Sanskrit using the Devnimori script. Yet, Devnimori is completely absent from Buddhaghosa's original works. Zero trace of it. He wrote in Sinhala. The source essentially argues that, hey, people naturally write in the script of their own culture. If he wrote his earliest masterpieces natively in Sinhala, he was in a region that used Sinhala.
To really drive this home, the source highlights this specific, honestly almost humorous anecdote from the texts to prove he was a local. Buddhaghosa is standing near the Pantoda well when two local female servants get into this vicious argument. Anticipating he might get dragged in as a witness, Buddhaghosa instantly transcribes their exact words onto a leaf. Later on, a local judge reads the leaf perfectly and uses it as evidence. So the crucial question is, how does a foreign scholar from northern India instantly comprehend and phonetically transcribe a deep, fast-paced rural Sri Lankan dialect right on the fly? And furthermore, how does the local Sri Lankan judge instantly read the handwriting of a supposed Indian foreigner? The logical conclusion drawn here is that Buddhaghosa, the women, and the judge all shared the exact same language, script, and local accent.
Section 5. Reassessing the book burning. So, if he was indeed a local scholar preserving local knowledge, what do we make of the darkest legend associated with his name? Let's reassess this infamous event. Mainstream history, which was heavily influenced by James Gray's English translation of the Burmese texts, tells a really shocking story. It claims that after Buddhaghosa finished translating the original Sinhala commentaries into Pali, he gathered all the original, priceless Sinhala texts, literally a pile as high as 7 elephants, placed them near the sacred Great Stupa, and maliciously set them on fire to ensure his translations were the only ones left standing. But this explainer's source argues that this is a catastrophic historical mistranslation. I mean, why would a devout scholar burn sacred texts in a highly revered sacred location? It makes no sense. The argument is that the original phrasing related to the words Jinibath Kala was fundamentally misunderstood by later translators. Drawing on the analysis of local monks, the source suggests the text actually refers to ranpit or jinipit, golden leaves used for accounting and precious records. Basically, Buddhaghosa didn't burn the books at all. He had that vast knowledge inscribed onto golden leaves and then respectfully and safely archived them inside a structure shaped like elephants within the stupa. So it wasn't an act of destruction, it was literally the ultimate act of preservation.
Finally, Section 6, a historical puzzle unresolved.
So we've unpacked the impossible boat journeys, the linguistics, and the massive mistranslations. And that leaves us with a huge question to ponder. Do the impossibilities of 2 wind-blown ships colliding mid-ocean, the absolute undeniable presence of the Sinhala script in supposed Indian texts, and his sudden fluency in deep rural dialects point to a deeply hidden history? A history where the world of Buddhaghosa existed entirely within the waterways and temples of ancient Sri Lanka? Our source leaves the challenge wide open to mainstream historians to provide the Sanskrit texts that prove otherwise. Until then, the case file remains totally open. What do you think? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. And remember, always keep questioning the history you read.